So Tony Blair has made quite a striking intervention against net zero. He says that basically current net zero policies are doomed to fail. And he has recognised that voters are asking why they're making so many sacrifices for when essentially the UK, much of the West, actually makes very little contribution to climate change. Tom, this is a hugely significant change, not least because Blair has been one of the great evangelists for net zero and climate policy.
No, absolutely. I mean, not for the first time, Tony Blair has made problems for his party by saying just something vaguely commonsensical for a change. I mean, you could call this preface that he wrote to a report produced by his, Tony Blair Institute for Global Regime Change, whatever it's called, which was trying to draw attention to the fact that essentially there's just no public buy-in with a lot of the measures which are being put forward, and also fundamentally that in the context of the global south rising, this is just a non-starter. So the fundamental points he's making, as you say, is that voters in the West, particularly in a country like Britain, are struggling to understand why they should be putting up with so much when it's going to have a negligible impact on global emissions. Again, statement of the bleeding obvious. And also that people in developing countries are looking at the demands being placed on them by supranational institutions, by Western NGOs, saying that whilst we might have developed using these fossil fuels, you're going to have to go a harder, more difficult, untested route. They're saying, no, thank you. And that is a political problem, which is just, you can't square that circle. It's a bit of a confused intervention insofar as he does call much of the debate irrational. He does call for the sorts of things that more sensible people in the environmental debate have been calling for some time: nuclear power, adaptation to climate, as well as some more kind of classically Blairite technocrat things like we've just got to have loads of AI and that will sort everything, because that seems to be his sort of answer to absolutely everything.
AI and ID cards.
Absolutely. That's how you sort the world out. But on top of that, there's also, a passage in there where he talks about how renewable energy is essential, it's cost effective, even though it's delivering in the UK sky high energy prices, and just across the water, historic blackouts on the Iberian Peninsula, quite plausibly. So it's one of those things where it's a confused intervention, which has allowed him to row back a little bit and suggest he wasn't directly criticising his party. But clearly it doesn't, it's a crack in that kind of elite climate consensus, which, as you say, Blair was very much a part of forging back when he was still in power.
Yeah, it does seem that, the sort of dominoes are falling a little bit on this issue. I mean, we had Kemi Badenoch saying the Tories they're not against net zero per se, but they're against the 2050 target. I mean, there have been so many instances this year of, whether it's the collapse of British Steel or the collapse of Port Talbot or, the collapse of the British car industry. There's been so many events where you'd think that this is the moment to wake up and smell the coffee, and you hear sort of incremental shifts from either the Labour Party or the Tories, but we never quite have that full-on realisation that actually this whole endeavour, the idea of essentially, moving towards renewables means using less energy, putting up the price of energy is actually quite, is in and of itself a folly and should be taken on more forcefully.
No, absolutely. And the idea that this was ever going to be a saleable political proposition, particularly when people started to wake up to the costs of these policies, which were often kind of hidden from them or a lot easier to absorb in better economic times. I think what's happened over the course of the past 5 years in particular is we've had, economic shocks, war, pestilence, and so on, is what has been clear for a long time, really, which is that environmentalism is like a luxury the West can no longer afford to indulge. And it's a fantasy that the developing world can see right through. They can see that no one has developed using these pie-in-the-sky technologies. The question is sort of what happens now. I mean, as confused as it is, Blair's intervention is interesting because he's kind of baffled as to why you've got governments and supranational institutions doubling down on policies which are both impractical and unpopular. The reason that is the case is because this is a question of ideology to a large extent. You've had a lot of politicians who don't stand for very much. You've got a lot of supranational institutions who want to accrue more power for themselves. So the idea that they can refashion themselves as the saviours of the planet and introduce policies which necessarily have to be imposed over the heads of nation states and citizens appeals to them quite intensely. You've also got a kind of more general establishment misanthropy, which has been building and kind of repackaging. It's been there, it's kind of always there to some extent, but it's repackaged itself in kind of green, faux progressive form. And you've also got a kind of capitalist class, which has been often struggles to kind of stick up for itself, to justify its own existence. And so it's been handed via the green thing both a kind of potential moral glow if they really lean into all of this, but also some quite tasty subsidy fueled business opportunities. Yeah. So there's a reason why this is very hard to dislodge. But at the same time, as you were saying at the beginning, this agenda is colliding now with economic reality and ordinary people in a way that it hasn't done previously. And at some point, something's got to give.